Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the stream. How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay, alright. Just gonna dial it up just in case. Okay, welcome to the stream. Alright. We have, sorry, it's being spotty. We have a few more stories to go. That would be... 1, 2, 3. We have 4 more stories to go. Hopefully I can at least read maybe 3. We will see. I accidentally began tonight's stream and ended it in about 5 seconds because the lag caused me to double click it. So I'm surprised this many people have found the link, but awesome. I will take it. Again, we have a classic mapled old-fashioned for tonight, and it seems like a few people don't know the basis on which we will be making different drinks. What I'm doing is making 1 drink per book because it gets expensive to make or to buy different kinds of alcohol, and also there's only so many recipes, so it's a long-winded way of saying that I'm broke. Okay. I feel like I look like a sports caster today. Not intentional, but the headset and the polo shirt kind of sell the look. Just making sure before I get started that I am audible. Audible, okay. Alright. Let's see how long we've got to go. Okay. This one's a bit of a lengthy story, but the longer I keep stalling, the longer I will be here tonight. So, but maybe someone might actually like that. But anyway, this one is called The Shunned House, Chapter 1. From even the greatest of horrors, irony is seldom absent. Sometimes it enters directly into the composition of events, while sometimes it relates only to the fortuitous position among persons and places. The latter sort is splendidly exemplified by a case in the ancient city of Providence, where, in the late 40s, Edgar Allan Poe used to sojourn, often during his unsuccessful wooing of the gifted poetress Mrs. Whitham. Poe generally stopped at the mansion house in Benefit Street, the renamed Golden Ball Inn, whose roof has sheltered Washington, Jefferson, Lafayette, and his favorite walk led northward along the same street to which Mrs. Whitman's home, and the neighboring hillside churchyard of St. John's, whose hidden expanse of the 18th century gravestones had for him a peculiar fascination. Now, the irony is this: in this walk, so many times repeated, the world's greatest master of the terrible and the bizarre was obliged to pass a particular house on the eastern side of the street, a dingy, antiquated structure perched on the abruptly rising side hill, with a great unkempt yard dating from a time when the region was partly open country. I feel like I'm cutting out a little bit. Can anybody confirm this? Anybody? Okay, no response. I will keep going, I guess. The house was, and for the matter that still is, of a kind to attract the attention of the curious. Originally a farm or semi-farm building, it followed the average New England colonial lines. of the middle 18th century. The prosperous peaked roof sort with the 2 stories of the dormless attic, and with the Gregorian doorway in the interior paneling dictated by the progress of taste of that time. It faced south, with one gable end buried to the lower windows in the eastward rising hill, and the other exposed to the foundations toward the street. Its construction, over a century and a half ago, had followed the grading and the straightening of the road in that especial vicinity. For Benefit Street, at first called Black Street, was laid out as a lane winding amongst the graveyards of the first settlers, and straightened only when the removal of the bodies to the north burial ground made it decently possible to cut through the old family plots. At the start, the western wall laden some 20 feet up a precipitous lawn for the roadway, but a widening of the street at about the time of the Revolution sheared off most of the intervening space, exposing the foundation so that a brick basement wall had to be made, giving the deep cellar a street frontage with door and 2 windows above ground, close to the new line of public travel. When the sidewalk was laid out a century ago, the last of the intervening space was removed, and Poe, in his walks, must have only seen the sheer ascent of the dull gray brick flush, with the sidewalk surmounted at the height of 10 feet by antique shingle bulk of the house proper. The farm-like grounds extended back very deeply up the hill, almost to Wheaton Street. The space south of the house, abutting a Benefit Street, was of course greatly above the existing sidewalk level, forming a terrace bound by a high bank wall of damp, mossy stone, pierced by a steep flight of narrow steps which led inward between canyon-like surfaces to the upper region of mangy lawn, roomy brick walls, and neglected gardens whose dismantled cement urns, rusted kettles fallen from tripods of knotty sticks, and similar paraphernalia set off the weather-beaten door with its broken fanlight, rotten ionic pilasters, and wormy triangular pediment. What I heard in my youth about the shunned house was merely that people died there in alarmingly great numbers. That, I was told, was why the original owners had moved out sometime 20 years after building the place. It was plainly unhealthy, perhaps because of the dampness and fungus growth in the cellar, the general sickish smell, and the drafts of the hallways, or the quality of the well and pump water. These things were bad, and there were all the gained belief among the persons whom I knew. Only the notebooks of my antiquarian uncle, Dr. Elihu Whipple, revealed to me at the length the darker, vaguer surmises which formed the undercurrent of folklore among us old-time servants and humble folk, surmises which never traveled far, and which were largely forgotten when Providence grew to be a metropolis with a shifting modern population. The general fact is that the house was never regarded by the solid part of the community as in any real sense haunted. There was no widespread tales of rattling chains, cold current air, extinguished lights, or faces at the window. Extremists sometimes said the house was unlucky, but that is as far as they ever went. What was really beyond dispute is the frightful proportion of persons that died there, or more accurately, had died there, since, after some peculiar happenings over 60 years ago, the building had become deserted through sheer impossibility of renting it. These persons were not all cut off suddenly by any cause. Rather, did it seem their vitality was insidiously sapped, so that each one died the sooner from whatever tendency to weakness he may have naturally had. And those who did not die displayed a varying type of anemia or consumption. and sometimes a decline of the mental faculties, which spoke ill of the sordidness of the building. Neighboring houses, it must be added, seemed entirely free of the noxious quality. This much I knew before my insistent questioning led my uncle to shew me the notes from which he finally embarked us both on our hideous investigation. In my childhood, the shunned house was vacant, with barren, gnarled, and terrible trees, long, queerly pale grass, and nightmarishly shapen weeds. In high terraced yard where birds never lingered, we boys used to overrun the place, and I can still recall my youthful terror not only at the morbid strangeness of the sinister vegetation, but at the eldritch atmosphere and the odor that of the dilapidated house, whose unlocked front door was often entered in the quest of shutters. The small paned windows were largely broken, and the nameless air of desolation hung from the precarious paneling, shaky interior shutters, peeling wallpaper, falling plaster, rickety staircases, and such fragments of battered furniture as still remained. The dust of the cobwebs added their touch of the fearful, and brave indeed was the boy who voluntarily ascended the ladder to the attic, a vast raftered length lighted only by the small blinking windows of the gable ends, and filled with a massed wreckage of chests, chairs, spinning wheels, which infinite years of deposit had shrouded and festooned into monstrous and hellish shapes. Sorry. But, after all, the attic was not the most terrible part of this house. It was the dank, humid cellar, which somehow exerted the strongest repulsion on us, even though it was wholly above the ground on the street side, with only a thin door and window-pierced brick wall to separate on the busy sidewalk. We scarcely knew whether to haunt it in the spectral fascination, or to shun it for the sake of our souls and our sanity. For one thing, the bad odor of the house was strongest there, and for another, we did not like the white fungus growths which occasionally sprang up in the rainy summer weather in the hard earth floor. These fungi, grotesquely like the vegetation in the yard outside, were truly horrible in their outlines, detestable parodies of toadstools and Indian pipes, whose like we had never seen in any other situation. They rotted quickly, and at one stage become slightly phosphorescent, so that the nocturnal passerbys sometimes spoke of the witch fires glowing behind broken panes or the fetor-spreading windows. We never knew even our wildest Halloween moods visited this cellar by night, but in some of our daytime visits could detect the phosphorescence, especially when the day was dark and wet. There was also a subtler thing that we thought often detected, a very strange thing, which was, however, merely suggestive of at most. I refer to it as a sort of cloudy, whitish pattern on the dirt floor, a vague, shifting deposit of mold or niter, which we sometimes thought would trace amidst the sparse fungus growths, near a huge fireplace in the basement kitchen. Once in a while, it struck us that this patch bore an uncanny resemblance to a doubled-up human figure, though generally no such kinship existed, and often there were no whitish deposit whatsoever. On a rainy afternoon, when this illusion seemed phenomenally strong, and when, in addition, I had fancied a glimpse of some kind of thin, yellowish, shimmering exhalation rising up from the nitrous pattern toward the yawning fireplace, I spoke to my uncle about the matter. He smiled at this old conceit, but it seemed as though his smile was tinged with reminiscence. Later, I heard that the similar notion entered into some kind of wild ancient tales of the common folk, a notion likewise alluding to ghoulish, wolfish shapes taken by smoke from the great chimney, and the queer contours assumed by certain of the sinuous tree roots that thrust their way into the cellar through loose foundation stones. Chapter 2. Not till my adult years did my uncle set before me the notes and data which he had collected concerning the shunned house. Dr. Whipple was a sane, conservative physician of the old school, and for all his interest in the place, was not eager to encourage young thoughts towards the abnormal. His own view, postulating simply a building and location of markedly unsanitary qualities, had nothing to do with abnormality, but he realized that the very picturesqueness which aroused his own interest would, in a boy's fanciful mind, take on all manner of gruesome imaginative associations. The doctor was a bachelor, a white-haired, clean-shaven, old-fashioned gentleman, and a local historian of note, who had often broken a lance with such controversial guardians of tradition as Sidney R. Ryder and Thomas W. Bicknell. He lived with one manservant in a Gregorian homestead, with knocker and iron-railed steps, balanced eerily on a step ascent of North Court Street, beside an ancient brick court and colony house where his grandfather, a cousin of celebrated privateersman Captain Whipple, who had burned His Majesty's armed schooner Gaspee in 1772, had voted in the legislature of May 4th, 1776, for the independence of Rhode Island colony. Around him, in the damp, low-ceiled library with musty white paneling, heavy carved overmantel, and small-paned vine windows, were the relics of records of his ancient family, among which were many dubious allusions to the shunned house in Benefit Street. That pest spot lies not far distant, for Benefit runs ledgewise just above the courthouse along the precipitous hill of which the first settlement climbed. When, in the end, my insistent pestering and maturing years evoked from my uncle the hoarded lore I sought, there lay before me a strange enough chronicle, long-winded, statistical, and drearily genealogical as some of the matter was. There ran through a continuous thread of brooding, tenacious horror and perpetual malevolence, which impressed me even more than it impressed me of a good doctor. Separate events fitted together uncannily, and seemingly irrelevant details held minds in hideous possibilities. A new and burning curiosity grew in me, compared to which my boyish curiosity was feeble and inchoate. The first revelation led to an exhaustive research, and finally to the shuddering quest which had proved so disastrous to myself and mine. For at last my uncle insisted on joining the search I had commenced, and after a certain night in that house he did not come away with me. I am lonely without that gentle soul whose long years were only filled with honor, virtue, good taste, benevolence, and learning. I have reared my marble urn to his memory in the St. John's churchyard, the place Poe loved, in a hidden grove of giant willows on the hill, whose tombs and headstones huddle quietly between the hoary bulk of the church and the houses of bank walls of Benefit Street. The history of the house, opening amidst a maze of dates about the prosperous of honorable family who built it, yet from the first taint of calamity soon increased the boding significance, was apparent. My uncle carefully compiled record began with the building of the structure in 1763, and followed the theme with an unusual amount of detail. The shunned house, it seems, was first inhabited by William Harris and his wife, Roby Dexter, with their children Elkanah, born in 1755, Abigail, born in 1757, and William Jr., born in 1759, and Ruth, born in 1761. Harris was a substantial merchant and seaman in the West India trade, connected with the firm of Obadiah Brown and his nephews. After Brown's death in 1761, a new firm of Nicholas Brown and Company made him a master of the brig Prudence. Providence built of 120 tons, thus enabling him to erect the new homestead he had desired ever since his marriage. Sorry, I'm getting very stuffy. There's really no air conditioning in here, and it's very stuffy in here, so I apologize. The site he had chosen, a recently straightened part of the new and fashionable back street, which ran along the side of the hill above crowded Cheapside, was that could be wished, and the building did justice to the location. It was best that the moderate means could afford, and Harris hastened to move in before the birth of the 5th child, which the family expected. That child, a boy, came in December, but was stillborn. Nor was any child to be born alive in that house for a century and a half. The next April, sickness occurred among the children, and Abigail and Ruth died before a month was over. Dr. Job Ives diagnosed the trouble as an infantile fever, though others declared it was more wasting away or decline. It seemed, in any event, to be contagious, for Hannah Bowen, one of the 2 servants, died of it in the following June. Eli Whittison, the other servant, constantly complained of weakness and would have returned to his father's farm in Rehoboth for a sudden attachment to Mehibithel Pierce, who was hired to succeed Hannah. He died the next year, a sad year indeed, since it marked the death of William Harris himself, enfeebled as he was by the climate of Martinique, where his occupation had kept him for his considerable periods during the preceding decade. The widowed Ruby Harris had never recovered from the shock of her husband's death. In the following year, the passing of the firstborn Elkanah 2 years later was the final blow to her reason. In 1768, she fell victim to a mild form of insanity, and was thereafter confined to the upper part of the house. Her elder maiden sister, Mercy Dexter, having moved in to take charge of the family. Mercy was a plain, raw-boned woman of great strength, but her health visibly declined from the time of her advent. She was greatly devoted to her unfortunate sister, and had an especial affection for her only surviving nephew William, who from a sturdy infant had become a sickly, spindling lad. In this year, the servant Mehibethel died, and the other servant, Preserve Smith, left without a coherent explanation, or at least with some wild tales and a complaint that he disliked the smell of the place. For a time, Mercy could secure no more help, since the 7 deaths in case of madness, all occurring within 5 years' space, had begun to set in motion a body of fireside rumor, which later became so bizarre. Ultimately, however, she obtained new servants from out of town. Anne White, a morose woman from that part of the North Kingstown, now set off the township of Exeter, and a capable Boston man named Zenas Lowe. It was Anne White who first gave definite shape of the sinister idle talk. Mercy should have known better than to hire anyone from Nooseneck Hill country, for that remote of backwoods was then, as now, the seat of the most uncomfortable superstitions. As lately as 1892, an Exeter community exhumed a dead body and ceremoniously burned its heart in order to prevent certain alleged visitations injurious of the public health and peace. And one may imagine the point of view of the same section in 1768. Hands, tongue, and perniciously active, and within a few months, Mercy discharged her, filling her place with a faithful and amiable Amazon from Newport, Maria Robbins. Meanwhile, poor Roby Harris, in her madness, gave voice to dreams and imaginings from the most hideous sort. At times, her screams became insupportable, and for long periods she would utter shrieking horrors which necessitated her son's temporary residence with his cousin, Peleg Harris, in Presbyterian Lane, on the new college building. The boy would seem to improve after these visits, and Mercy been as wise as she was well-meaning, she would have let him live permanently with Peleg. Just what Miss Harris cried out in her fits of violence, tradition hesitates to say, or rather presents such extravagant accounts that they nullify themselves through sheer absurdity. Certainly, it sounds absurd to hear that a woman educated only from the rudiments of French often shouted for hours in a coarse and idiomatic form of that language, or that the same person, alone and guarded, complained wildly of staring things which bit and chewed at her. And in 1772, the servant Zenas died, and when Miss Harris heard of it, she laughed with a shocking delight, utterly foreign to her. The next year, she herself died, and was laid to rest in the North Burial Ground beside her husband. Upon the outbreak of trouble with Great Britain in 1775, William Harris, despite his scant 16 years and feeble constitution, managed to enlist in the Army of Observation under General Greene. And from that time on, he enjoyed a steady rise in health and prestige. In 1780, a captain in Rhode Island forces in New Jersey under Colonel Angell, he met and married Phoebe Hetfield of Elizabethtown, whom he had brought to Providence upon his honorable discharge that in the following year. The young soldier's return was not a thing of unmitigated happiness. The house, it is true, was still in good condition, and the street had been widened and changed in name from Back Street to Benefit Street. But Mercy Dexter's once robust frame had undergone a sad and curious decay, so that she was now a stooped and pathetic figure with hollow voice and disconcerting pallor. Qualities shared but to a singular degree by the one remaining servant, Maria. In the autumn of 1782, Phoebe Harris gave birth to a stillborn daughter, and on the 15th of the next May, Mercy Dexter took her leave of a useful, austere, virtuous life. William Harris, at last thoroughly convinced of the radically unhealthful nature of his abode, now took steps toward quitting it and closing it forever, securing temporary quarters for himself and his wife in a newly opened Golden Ball Inn. He arranged for the building of a new and finer house in Westminster Street, in the growing part of town across Great Bridge. There in 1785, his son Dutay was born, and there his family dwelt until the encroachments of commerce drove them back across the river, over the hill of Angell Street. In the newer East Side residence district, where the late Archer Harris built his sumptuous but hideous French roof mansion in 1876, William and Phoebe both succumbed to the yellow fever epidemic of 1797, but Dutay was brought up by his cousin Rathbone Harris, Peleg's son. Rathbone was a practical man and rented the Benefit Street house despite William's wish to keep it vacant. He considered it an obligation to his ward to make the most of his boy's property, nor did he concern himself with the deaths and illness which caused so many changes of tenants, and the steadily growing aversion which the house was generally regarded. It is likely that he felt only vexation when, in 1804, the town council ordered the account of the much-discussed deaths of 4 persons, presumably caused by the I am not with it tonight, sorry. The then diminishing fever epidemic. They said the place had been febrile smell. Dutay had himself thought little of the house, for he had grew up to be a privateersman, and served with distinction in the Vigilant under Captain Cahoon of the War of 1812. He returned unharmed, married in 1884, and became a father on that memorable night of September 23rd, 1815, when the great gale drove the waters of the bay over the half-town and floated up the tall stoop well over Westminster Street, so that the mass almost tapped the Harris windows in symbolic affirmation that the new boy, Welcome, was a seaman's son. Welcome did not survive the father, but lived to perish gloriously in Fredericksburg in 1862. Neither he nor his son Archer knew of the shunned house as other than a nuisance almost impossible to rent, perhaps on the account of the mustiness and sickly odor, unkempt old age. Indeed, it was never rented after the series of deaths culminating in 1861, which the excitement of the war tended to throw into obscurity. Carrington Harris, last of the male line, knew it was only deserted and somewhat picturesque center of a legend until I told him my experience. He had meant to tear it down and build an apartment house on the site, but after my account decided to let it stand, install plumbing, and rent it. Nor has he yet had any difficulty obtaining tenants. The horror has gone. Chapter 3. It may be imagined how powerfully I was affected in the annals of the Harrises, but in the continuous record, there seemed to be a brood and a persistent evil beyond anything in nature, as I had known it, an evil clearly connected with the house and not with the family. This impression was continued by my uncle's less systematic array of miscellaneous data. Legends, transcribed from servant gossip, cutting from the paper, copies of death certificates of fellow physicians, and the like. All of this material I cannot hope to give, for my uncle was a tireless antiquarian and was deeply interested in the shunned house, but I may refer to several dominant points which are noticed by their recurrence through many reports from diverse sources. For example, the servant gossip was practically unanimous in attributing to the fungus and malodorous cellar of the house a vast supremacy and evil influence. There had been servants, and white especially, who would not use the cellar kitchen, and at least 3 well-defined legends bore upon the queer quasi-human or diabolic outlines assumed by the tree roots and patches of mold in that region. These latter narratives interested me profoundly on account of what I had seen in my boyhood, but I felt that most of significance had in each case been largely obscured by additions from the common stock of local ghost lore. Anne White, with her Exeter superstition, had promulgated the most extravagant and at the same time most consistent tale, alleging there must be some lie buried beneath the house, one of those vampires, the dead who retain their bodily form and live on the breath of the living, whose hideous legions send their preying shapes or spirits abroad by night. To destroy a vampire, one must, the grandmother say, exhume it and burn its heart, or at least drive a stake through that organ, and and Anne's dogged insistence on the search under the cellar had been prominent in bringing out her discharge. Her tales, however, commanded a wide audience and were more readily accepted because the house indeed stood upon a land once used for burial purposes. To me, their interest depended on less of the circumstance than more on the peculiarly appropriate way in which they dovetailed with other certain things. The complaint of the departing servant preserved Smith, who had preceded and had never heard of her, that something sucked his breath at night. The death certificates of the fever victims in 1804, issued by Dr. Chad Hopkins, ensuing the 4 deceased persons, all accountably lacking in blood, and the obscure passages of poor Roby Harris's ravings, where she had complained of the sharp teeth of the glassy-eyed, half-visible presence. Free from unwarranted superstition though I am, these things produced in me an odd sensation, which was intensified by a pair of widely separated newspaper cuttings related to the deaths in the shunned house, one of the Providence Gazette and one of Country Journal in April 12th, 1815, and the other of the Daily Transcript and Chronicle on October 27th, 1845, each of which detailed an appallingly grisly circumstance whose duplication was remarkable. It seems that in both instances the dying person, in 1815, a gentle old lady named Stafford, and in 1845, a school teacher of middle age named Eleazar Durfee, became transfigured in a horrible way, glaring glassily and attempting to bite at the throat of an attending physician. Even more puzzling, though, was the final case, which put an end to the renting of the house, a series of anemia deaths preceded by progressive madness, wherein the patient would craftily attempt the lives of his relatives by incisions in the neck or wrist. This was in 1860 and 1861, when my uncle had just begun his medical practice, and before leaving the front he had heard much from his elder professional colleagues. The really inexplicable thing was the way in which the victims, ignorant people, for the ill-smelling and widely shunned house could now be rented to no others, would babble maledictions in French, a language they could not possibly have studied to any extent. It made one think of poor Roby Harris, nearly a century before, and so moved my uncle that he commenced collecting historical data on the house after listening, sometime subsequent to his return from the war, to the first-hand account of Dr. Chase Whitmarsh. Indeed, I could see that my uncle had thought deeply on the subject, and that he was glad of my own interest, an open-minded and sympathetic interest which enabled him to discuss me matters at which others would merely have laughed. His fancy had not gone far as mine, but he had felt that the place was rare in its imaginative and potentialities, and was worthy of note as an inspiration in the field of the grotesque and macabre. For my part, was disposed to take the whole subject with profound seriousness, and begin at once not only to review the evidence, but to accumulate as much as I could. I talked with the elderly Archer Harris, the owner of the house, many times before his death in 1916, and obtained with him and his still surviving maiden sister, Alice, an authentic corroboration of the family data that my uncle had collected. When, however, I asked him what connection with France or its language the house could have, they confessed themselves as frankly baffled and ignorant as I. Archer knew nothing, and all that Miss Harris could say was that old illusion of her grandfather, Dute Harris, had shed a little light. The old seaman who had survived his son's Welcome's death in battle 2 years had not known himself the legend, but recalled that the earliest nurse, the ancient Maria Robbins, seemed darkly aware of something that might have weird significance to the French ravings of Roby Harris, which she had so often heard during the last days of that hapless woman. Maria had been shunned from the house in 1769 till the removal of the family in 1783, and had seen Mercy Dexter die. Once she had hinted that the child Dute of a somewhat peculiar circumstance in Mercy's last moments, but he had soon forgotten all about it save for something peculiar. The granddaughter, moreover, recalled even this much with difficulty. She and her brother were not so much interested in the house as was Archer's son Carrington, the present owner, with whom I had talked after my experience. Having exhausted the Harris family of all the information it could furnish, I turned my attention to the early town records and deeds with a zeal more penetrating than that of which my uncle had occasionally shewn in the same work. What I wished was a comprehensive history of the site from its very settlement in 1636, or even before, if any Narragansett Indian could be unearthed to supply the data. I found, at the start, that the land had been part of a long strip of home lot guaranteed originally to John Throckmorton, one of many strips beginning at the town street, beside the river extending up over the hill to a line roughly corresponding with modern Hope Street. The Throckmorton lot had later, of course, been much subdivided, and I became very assiduous in tracing the section through which Back or Benefit Street was later run. It had, a rumor indeed said, been that Throckmorton graveyard, but as I examined the records more carefully, I found that the graves had all been transferred at an early date to North Burial Ground on the Potwocket West Road. Then I suddenly came by a rare piece of chance, since it was not in the main body of records. It might have easily been missed upon something which aroused my keenest eagerness, fitting in as it did with several of the queerest phases of the affair. It was the record of the lease in 1697, in which a small tract of ground to an Etienne Rouet and his wife. At last the French element had appeared, that and another deeper element of horror which the name conjured up by the darkest recesses of my weird and heterogeneous reading. And I feverishly studied the plating upon the locality, as it had been before the cutting and partial straightening of Back Street, which 1747 and 1758 I found what I had half expected, that there was the shunned house now stood at the Roulettes, who had laid out their graveyard behind a one-story and attic cottage, and that no record of any transfer of graves existed. The document, indeed, ended in much confusion, and I was forced to ransack both the Rhode Island Historical Society and Shepley Library before I could find a local door which came with the name Etienne Rouet would unlock. In the end, though, I did find something of which vague, monstrous import that I set about once to examine in the cellar of the shunned house itself with its new and excited minuteness. The Roulettes, I don't know how to pronounce this, it's French, it seemed, had come in 1696 from East Greenwich down the west shore of Narragansett Bay, which were Huguenots from Cod, and had encountered much opposition before the Providence selectmen allowed them in to settle in the town. Unpopularity had dogged them from East Greenwich, whither they had come in 1686 after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and rumor said that the cause of dislike extended beyond mere racial and national prejudice, or the land disputes which involved other French settlers with the English, and rivalries which not even Governor Andros could quell. But their ardent Protestantism, too ardent, some whispered, and their evident distress when virtually driven from the village, down at the bay, had moved the sympathy of the town fathers. Here the strangers had been granted a haven, and the swarthy Etienne Rouet, less apt to agriculture than reading queer books and drawing queer diagrams, was given a clerical post in the warehouse of Pardon Tillinghast Wharf, far south of Town Street. There had, however, been a riot of some sort later on, perhaps 40 years later, after old Rouet's death, and no one seemed to hear of the family after that. For a century and more, it appeared that the Rouets have been remembered and frequently discussed as vivid incidents in the quiet life of a New England seaport. Etienne's son, Paul, a surly fellow whose erratic conduct had probably provoked the riot which wiped out the family, was particularly a source of speculation, and though Providence never shared the witchcraft panics of her Puritan neighbors, it was freely intimidated by old wives that his prayers were neither uttered at the proper time nor directed toward the proper object. All this had undoubtedly formed the basis of the legend known by old Maria Robbins. What relation it had to the French ravings of Rovey Harris and the other inhabitants of the shunned house, imagination or future discovery alone could determine. I wondered how many of those who had known the local legends realized the additional link of which the item of the annals of the morbid horror which tells of the creature of Jacques Rouet of Caude, who in 1598 was condemned to death by a demonic but afterwards saved from the stake of the Paris Parliament and shut into a madhouse. He had been found covered with blood and shreds of flesh in the wood shortly after the killing by rendering a boy by a pair of wolves. One wolf was seen to lope away unhurt, surely a pretty hearthside tale, but with a queer significance as to name and place. But I decided that the Providence gossips could not have generally known it. Sorry, I'm parched. Had they known, the coincidence of names would not have brought some drastic and frightened action. Indeed, might not its limited whispering have precipitated the final riot in which it erased the Rouets from the hometown? I now visited the accursed place with increased frequency, studying the unwholesome vegetation of the garden, examining all the walls of the building, and poring over every inch of earth and cellar floor. Finally, with Carrington Harris's permission, I fitted the key into the disused door opening from the cellar directly upon Benefit Street. Preferring to have a more immediate access front door could give there, where morbidity lurked most thickly, I searched and poked during the long afternoons, which the sunlight filtered through the cobwebbed above-ground windows, and a sense of security glowed through the unlocked door, which placed only a few feet above the placid sidewalk outside. Nothing new rewarded my efforts, only the same depressing mustiness and faint suggestions of noxious odors and nitrous outlines on the floor. And I fancy that many pedestrians must have watched me curiously through the broken panes. At length, on the suggestion of my uncles, I decided to try the spot nocturnally, and one stormy midnight ran the beams of the electric torch over the moldy floor, with its uncanny shapes and distorted half-phosphorescent fungi. The place had dispirited me curiously that evening, and I was almost prepared when I saw, or thought I saw, amidst the blue and whitish spots of a particularly sharp definition of the huddled form. I suspected from boyhood its clearness was astonishing, unprecedented, and as I watched, I seemed to see the more thin, yellowish, shimmering exhalation, which had startled me on a rainy afternoon so many years before. Above the anthropomorphic patch of mold by the fireplace, it rose a subtle, sickish, almost luminous vapor, which, as it hung trembling in the dampness, seemed to develop a vague and shocking suggestion of form, gradually trailing off to a nebulous decay as passing into the blackness of the great chimney with Fetter in its wake. It was truly horrible, and the more so to me because of what I knew of the spot. Refusing to flee, I watched it fade, and as I watched it felt as it was watching me from greedily, with eyes more imaginable than visible. When I told my uncle about it, he was greatly aroused, and after a tense hour of reflection, arrived at a definite and drastic decision. Weighing in on his mind the importance of the matter and the significance of our relation to it, he insisted that we both test and, if possible, destroy the horror in the house by a joint night or nights of aggressive vigil in that musty, fungus-cursed cellar. On Wednesday, June 25th, 1919, after a proper modification of Carrington Harris's, which did not include surmises as to what we expected to find, my uncle and I conveyed to the shunned house 2 camp chairs and folding camp cot, together with some scientific mechanism of greater weight and intricacy. These we placed in the ceiling during the day, screening the windows with paper and planning to return to the evening for our first vigil. We had locked the door from the cellar to the ground floor, having a key to the outside cellar door. We were prepared to leave our expensive and delicate apparatus, which we had obtained secretly at great cost. As many days as our vigils might have need to be protracted, it was our design to sit up together till very late, and then watch singingly till dawn, 2-hour stretches, myself first, and then my companion, the inactive member resting on a cot. Welcome to the stream, Joe. Thank you for coming. Congratulations. The natural leadership which my uncle procured from the instruments from the laboratories of Brown University and Cranston Street Armory, and instinctively assumed direction of our venture, was a marvelous commentary on the potential vitality and resilience of man of 81. Elihu Whipple had lived accordingly to the hygienic laws he had preached to a physician, but for what happened later would be here at full vigor with today. Only 2 persons suspect what did happen, Carrington Harris and myself. I had to tell Harris because he owned the house and deserved to know what had gone out of it. Then, too, we had spoken to him in advance of our quest. I felt after my uncle's going that he would understand and assist me in some vitally necessary public explanations. He turned very pale, but agreed to help me, and decided it would now be safe to rent the house. To declare that we were not nervous on that rainy night of watching would be an exaggeration, both gross and ridiculous. We were not, as I have said, in any sense childishly superstitious, but scientific study and reflection had taught us that the known universe of 3 dimensions embraces the merest fraction of the whole cosmos, of substance and energy. In this case, an overwhelming proportance of evidence had numerous and authentic sources pointed to be tenacious experience of certain forces great in power, and so, as the human point of view is concerned, exceptional malignancy. To say that we actually believed in vampires or werewolves would be a carelessly inclusive statement. Rather, must it be said that we were not prepared to deny the possibility of certain unfamiliar and unclassified modifications of a vital force in attenuated matter existing very infrequently in 3-dimensional space because of the more intimate connection with other spatial units, yet close enough in the boundary of our own to furnish us the occasional manifestations which we, for lack of proper vantage point, may never hope to understand. In short, it seemed to my uncle and me that I don't know what that word is, array of facts pointed to some lingering influence in the shunned house, traceable to one or another in the ill-favored French settlers of 2 centuries before, and still operative through a rare and unknown laws of atomic and electronic motion, that the family of Roulet had possessed an abnormally affinity for outer circles of entity, dark spheres which, for normal folk, had only repulsion and terror. Their recorded history seemed to have proved, had not then the riots had those bygone 1730s set moving certain kinetic patterns in which the morbid brain of one or more of them, notably the sinister Paul Roulet, which obscurely survived the bodies murdered and buried by the mob, and continued to function in some multiple dimension space along the original lines of force determined by the frantic hatred of the encroaching community. This is a hard story. Such a thing was surely not physical or biochemical impossibility in the light of a newer science, which includes the theories of a relatively interatomic action. One might easily imagine an alien nucleus of substance or energy, formless or otherwise, kept alive by imperceptible and immaterial subtractions from a life force or bodily tissues and fluids from other more palpably living things, into which it penetrates, and with whose fabric it sometimes completely merges itself. It might be actively hostile, or it might be dictated merely by blind motives of self-preservation. In any case, such a monster must of necessity be in our scheme of things an anomaly and an intruder whose extirpation forms on a primary duty which every man not an enemy to world's life, health, and sanity. What baffled us was our utter ignorance of the aspect in which we might encounter the thing. No sane person had ever seen it, and few had ever felt it indefinitely. It might be pure energy, a form ethereal and outside the realm of substance, or it might be partly material, some unknown and unequivocal mass of plasticity, capable of changing at will with two nebulous approximations of the solid, liquid, gaseous, or even tenuously unparticled states. The anthropomorphic patch of mold on the floor, the form of a yellowish vapor, with the curvature of tree roots and some of the old tales, all argued at least some remote and reminiscent connection with the human shape. But how representative or permanent the similarity might be, none could say with any kind of certainty. We had devised 2 weapons to fight it. A large and specially fitted Crookes tube, operated by powerful storage batteries and provided with peculiar screens and reflectors, in case it proved intangible and opposable by vigorously destructive either radiations, and a pair of military flamethrowers of the sort used in the World War, in case it proved partly material and susceptible to mechanical destruction. For like the superstitious Exeter rustics, we were prepared to burn the thing's heart out if the heart existed to burn. All of this aggressive mechanism we set in the cellar in positions carefully arranged with reference to the cot and chairs, and to the spot before the fireplace where the mold had taken strange shapes. That suggestive patch, by the way, was only faintly visible when placed our furniture and instruments, and when we returned to the evening for the actual vigil. For a moment, and I had self-doubted that I had ever seen a more definite, limited form, but then I thought of the legends. Our cellar vigil began at 10 p.m. daylight savings time, and as it continued, we found no promise of pertinent developments. A weak, filtered glow from the rain-harassed street lamps outside, and a feeble phosphorescence from the detestable fungi within, shewed the dripping stone of the walls, from which all traces of whitewash had vanished, and dank, fetid, mildew-tainted hard earth floor, with its obscene fungi, the rotting remnants of what had been stools, chairs, and tables, and often more shapeless furniture, with heavy planks and massive beams on the ground floor overhead. The decrepit plank floor, leading to bins and chambers beneath other parts of the house, the crumbling stone staircase with ruined wooden handrail, and the crude and cavernous fireplace of blackened brick, where rusted iron fragments revealed the past presence of hooks, andirons, spit, crane, and a door to the Dutch oven. These things, and our austere cot and camp chairs, and the heavy and intricate destructive machinery we had brought. We had, in my own former explorations, left the door to the street unlocked, so that a direct and practical path of escape might lie open in case the manifestation beyond our power to deal with. It was our idea that our continued nocturnal presence would call forth whatever malign entity lurked here, and that, being prepared, we could dispose of the thing with one or the other of our provided means as soon as we had recognized and observed it sufficiently. How long it might require to evoke and extinguish the thing, we had no notion. It occurred to us, too, that our adventure was far from safe, for in what strength the thing might appear, no one could tell. But we deemed the game worth the hazard, and embarked on it alone, and unhesitatingly conscious that the seeking of the outside aid would only expose us to ridicule and perhaps defeat our entire purpose. Such was our frame of mind as we talked far into the night, till my uncle, growing's drowsiness made me remind him to lie down for his 2-hour sleep. Something like the fear chilled me as I sat there in a small hours alone. I say alone, for one who sits by a sleeper indeed alone. perhaps more alone than he can realize. My uncle breathed heavily, his deep inhalations and exhalations accompanied by the rain outside, and punctuated by another nerve-wracking sound of distant dripping water within. For the house was repulsively damp, even in the dry weather, and in this storm positively swamp-like. I studied the loose antique masonry of the walls in the fungus light, with feeble rays which stole in from the street through the screened windows, and once, when the noisome atmosphere of the place seemed about to sicken me, I opened the door and looked up and down the street, feasting my eyes on familiar sights and my nostrils on the wholesome air. Still, nothing occurred to reward my watching, and I yawned repeatedly, fatigue getting the better of my apprehension. Then the stirring of my uncle in his sleep attracted my notice. He had turned restlessly on the cot several times during the latter half of the first hour, but now he was breathing with unusual irregularity, occasionally heaving a sigh which held more than a few qualities of a choking moan. I turned my electric flashlight on and found that his face averted, so rising and crossing to the other side of the cot. I again flashed my light to see if he seemed in any pain. What I saw unnerved me most surprisingly, considering its relative triviality. It must have been merely the association of any old circumstance with the sinister nature of our location and mission, for surely the circumstance was not itself frightful or unnatural. It was merely that my uncle's facial expression, disturbed no doubt by the strange dreams which our situation prompted, betrayed by considerable agitation, and seemed not at all characteristic of him. His habitual expression was one kindly and well-bred calm, whereas now variety of emotions seemed struggling within him. I think, on the whole, that was this variety which chiefly disturbed me. My uncle, as he gasped and tossed in increasing perturbation, and with his eyes that had now started to open, seemed not of one by many men, and suggested a curious quality of alienage from himself. Do you hear it now? Okay, great. Yeah, we're having a lot of microphone weirdness tonight. I don't know what it is. Okay. He said, floated off from a very ordinary series of dream pictures into a scene whose strangeness was related to nothing he had ever read. It was of this world, and yet not of it. A shadowy geometrical confusion in which he could be seen the elements of familiar things in the most unfamiliar and perturbing combinations. There was a suggestion of queerly disordered pictures superimposed one upon the other, an arrangement which the essentials of time as well as space seemed dissolved in the mixed in the most illogical fashion. In this kaleidoscopic vortex of phantasmal images were the occasional snapshots, if one might use the term, of singular clearness but uncountable heterogeneity. Once my uncle thought he lay in a carelessly dug open pit, with a crowd of angry faces framed by straggling locks and three-cornered hats frowning down upon him. Again, he seemed to be in the interior of a house, an old house, apparently, but the details of the inhabitants were constantly changing, and he could never be certain of the faces or the furniture, or even that of the room itself, since the doors and windows seemed to in just a great state of flux, as the more presumably mobile objects. It was queer, damnably queer, that my uncle spoke almost sheepishly, as if half expecting not to be believed, when he declared that half of the strange faces, many of the had unmistakably borne the features of the Harris family, and all the while there was the personal sensation of choking, as if a pervasive presence had spread itself through his body and sought to possess itself of vital processes. I shuddered at the thought of the vital processes, worn as they were in 81 years of continuous functioning, and in conflict with unknown forces of which the youngest and strongest system might as well be afraid. But in another moment reflected that dreams are only dreams, and that the uncomfortable visions could be, at most, no more than my uncle's reaction to the investigation and expectations which had lately filled our minds to the exclusion of all else. Conversation, also, soon tended to dispel the sense of strangeness, and in time I yielded to the yawns and took to my turn of slumber. My uncle seemed now very wakeful and welcomed his period of watching, though through the nightmare had aroused him far ahead of his allotted 2 hours. Sleep seized me quickly, and I was at once haunted with dreams of the most disturbing kind. I felt, in my visions, a cosmic and abysmal loneliness, with hostility surging from all sides upon some prison where I lay confined. I seemed bound and gagged and taunted by the echoing yells of distant multitudes who thirsted for my blood. My uncle's face came to me with less pleasant associations than in my waking hours, and I recall many futile struggles and attempts to scream. It was not a pleasant sleep, and for a second I was not sorry for the echoing shriek which clove through the barriers of dream and flung me into a sharp and startled awakeness, in which every actual object before my eyes stood out with more natural clearness and reality. Telling you, this is a hard story. Chapter 5. I had not been lying with my face away from my uncle's chair, so that the sudden flash of awakening, I saw only the door to the street, a more northerly window, and the wall, the floor, and the ceiling, toward the north of the room, all photographed with morbid vividness on my brain, in a light brighter than the glow of the fungi or the rays from the street outside. It was not a strong, or even fairly strong light, certainly not nearly strong enough to read an average book by, but it cast a shadow of myself and the cot on the floor, and had a yellowish penetrating force that hinted at things more potent than luminosity. This I perceived with unhealthy sharpness, despite the fact that two of my other senses were violently assailed, for on my ears rang the reverberations of the shocking scream, while my nostrils revolted at the stench of the filth that filled the place. My mind, as alert as my senses, recognized the gravely unusual, and almost automatically I leapt up and turned, about to grasp the destructive instruments which we had left trained on the moldy spot before the fireplace. As I turned, I dreaded for what I was to see, for the scream had been in my uncle's voice, and I knew not against what menace I should have to defend him and myself. Yet after all, the sight was worse than I had dreaded. There are horrors beyond horrors, and this was one of those nuclei of the dreamable hideousness which the cosmos saves to blast and curse an unhappy few. Out of the fungus-ridden earth streamed up a vaporous corpse light, yellow and diseased, which bubbled and lapped into a gigantic height, in vague outlines half human and half monstrous, though which I could see with the chimney and fireplace beyond. It was all eyes, wolfish and mocking, and the rugose, insect-like head dissolved at the top of the thin stream of mist, which curled putridly about and finally vanished up the chimney. I say I saw this thing, but it is only in conscious retrospection that I ever retraced its damnable approach to form. At the time, it was to me only a seething, dimly phosphorescent cloud of fungus loathsomeness, enveloping and dissolving to an abhorrent plasticity the one object to which all my attention was focused. That object was my uncle, the venerable Elihu Whipple, who, with blackening and decaying features, leered and gibbered at me, and reached out dripping claws to rend me in the fury which this horror had brought. It was a sense of routine which kept me from going mad. I had drilled myself in preparation for the crucial moment, and blind training saved me, recognizing the bubbling evil as no substance reachable by matter or material chemistry, and therefore ignoring the flamethrower which loomed to my left. I threw on the current of the Crookes tube apparatus and focused toward the scene of the immortal blasphemousness, the strongest ether radiations which man's art can arouse from spaces and fluids of nature. There was a bluish haze and frenzied sputtering, and the yellowish phosphorescence grew dimmer to my eyes, but I saw the dimness was only that of contrast, and that the waves from the machine had no effect whatsoever. Then, in the midst of the demonic spectacle, I saw a fresh horror, which brought cries to my lips and sent me fumbling and staggering toward the unlocked door to the quiet street, careless of what abnormal terrors I loosed upon the world, or what thoughts or judgments of men I had brought down upon my head. In that dim blend of blue and yellow, the form of my uncle had commenced a nauseous liquefaction, whose essence eludes all description, and in which there played across had a vanishing face, such changes of identity as only madness can conceive. He was at once a devil and a multitude, a charnel house and a pageant. What by the mixed and uncertain beams. That gelatinous face assumed a dozen, a score, 100 aspects, grinning as it sank to the ground on a body that melted like a tallow in the caricatured likeness of Legion Strange and Not Yet Strange. I saw the features of the Harris line, masculine and feminine, adult and infantile, and the other features of old and young, coarse and refined, familiar and unfamiliar. For a second there flashed a degraded counterfeit of the miniature poor, mad Roby Harris that I had seen in the School of Design Museum. In another time I had thought I saw a raw-boned image of the Mercy Dexter, as I recalled her from a painting of Carrington Harris's house. It was frightful beyond conception toward the last, when a curious blend of servant and baby visages flickered close to the fungus floor, where a pool of greenish grease was spreading. It seemed as though the shifting features fought against themselves and strove to form contours like that of my uncle's kindly face. I like to think that he existed at that moment, and that he tried to bid me farewell. It seems to me I had coughed a farewell from my own parched throat as I lurched out on the street, a thin stream of grease following me throughout the door into the rain-drenched sidewalk. The rest is shadowy and monstrous. There was no one in the soaking street. In all the world, there was no one I dared tell. I walked aimlessly south past College and Athenaeum, down Hopkins Street, and over the bridge to the business section, where tall buildings seemed to guard me from the modern material things guard the world from the ancient and unwholesome wonder. Then gray dawn unfolded wetly past the east, silhouetting the archaic hill in its venerable steeples, and beckoning me to the place where my terrible work was still unfinished. And in that end, I went wet, hatless, and dazed into the morning light, and entered that awful door in Benefit Street, where I had left ajar, and which still swung cryptically in the full sight of the early householders to whom I dared not speak. The grease was gone, for the moldy floor was porous, and in front of the fireplace was no vestige of the giant deviled-up form in a niter. I looked at the cot and the chairs and the instruments, my neglected hat and the yellowed straw hat of my uncle. Dazedness was uppermost, and I could scarcely recall what was the dream and what was reality. Then thought trickled back. I knew that I had witnessed things more horrible than I had dreamed. Sitting down, I tried to conjecture as nearly as sanity would let me, just to know what happened and how I might end the horror, if indeed it had been real. Matter it not seemed to be, nor anything else conceivable by mortal mind. What, then, but some exotic emanation, some vampirish vapor, some Exeter rustics tell of a lurking over certain churchyards? Then, I felt, was the clue, and again I looked at the floor before the fireplace where the mold and the niter had taken strange forms. Sorry, I am so thirsty. In 10 minutes, my mind was made up, and taking my hat, I set out for home, where I bathed, ate, and gave my telephone an order for a pickaxe, a spade, a military gas mask, and 6 carboys of sulfuric acid, all to be delivered the next morning at the cellar door of the shunned house in Benefit Street. After that, I tried to sleep, and failing, passed the hours in reading, and the composition of inane verses to counteract my mood. At 11 a.m. the next day, I commenced digging. It was sunny weather, and I was glad of that. I was still alone, for as much of the fear I had the unknown sought, there was more fear in the thought of telling anybody. Later, I told Harris, only through sheer necessity, and because he had heard odd tales from old people, which disposed him ever so little toward belief. As I turned up the stinking black earth in front of the fireplace, my spade causing a vicious yellow ichor to ooze from the white fungi which it severed. I trembled at the dubious thoughts of what I might uncover. Some secrets of inner earth are not good for mankind, and this seemed to me one of them. My hand shook perceptibly, but still I delved, after a while standing in a large hole that I made. With the deepening of the hole, which was about 6 feet square, an evil smell increased, and I lost all doubt of my imminent contact with the hellish thing whose emanation had cursed the house for over a century. I wondered what it would look like, and what its form and substance would be, and how big it might have waxed through the long ages of life-sucking. At length I climbed out of the hole and dispersed the heaped-up dirt, then arranging the great carboys of acid around the near two sides, so that, when necessary, I might empty them all down the aperture in a quick succession. After that, I dumped only the other two sides, working more slowly and donning my gas mask as the smell grew. I was nearly unnerved at my proximity to the nameless thing at the bottom of the pit. Suddenly, my spade struck something softer than earth. I shuddered and made a motion as if to climb out of the hole, which was now as deep as my neck. Then courage returned, and I scraped away more dirt in the light of the electric torch I had provided. The surface I had uncovered was fishy and glassy, a kind of semi-putrid congealed jelly with suggestions of translucency. I scraped further and saw that it had form. There was a rift where a part of the substance was folded over. An exposed area was huge and roughly cylindrical, like a mammoth soft blue light stovepipe doubled in two. Its largest part of some 2 feet in diameter. Still more I scraped, and then abruptly I leapt out of the hole and away from the filthy thing, frantically stopping and tilting the heavy carboys, and precipitating their corrosive contents one after the other down upon the charnel gulf and upon the unthinkable abnormality whose Titan elbow I had seen. The blinding maelstrom of greenish-yellow vapor which surged tremendously up upon the hole as the flood of acid descended will never leave my memory. For along the hill, people tell of the yellow day when virulent and horrible fumes arose from the factory waste dumped in the Providence River, but I know how mistaken they are as to the source. They tell, too, of the hideous roar which at the same time came from the disordered water pipe or gas main underground, but again, I could correct them even if I dared. It was unspeakably shocking, and I do not see how I lived through it. I did faint after emptying the fourth carboy, which I had to handle after the fumes after it began to penetrate my mask. But when I recovered, I saw the hole was emitting no fresh vapors. The 2 remaining carboys I emptied down without particular result, and after a time I felt it safe to shovel the earth back into the pit. It was twilight before I was done, but fear had gone out of the place. The dampness was less fetid, and all the strange fungi had withered to some kind of harmless grayish powder which blew ash-like along the floor. One of Earth's nethermost terrors had perished forever, and if there be there a hell. It had received the last demon soul of an unhallowed thing, and as I patted down the last spadeful of mold, I shed the first of many tears which I had paid an unaffected tribute to my beloved uncle's memory. The next spring, no more pale grass and strange weeds came from the shunned house's terrace garden, and shortly afterward, Carrington Harris rented the place. It is still spectral, but its strangeness fascinates me, and I shall find mixed with my relief a queer regret when it is torn down to make way for a tawdry shop or a vulgar apartment building. The barren old trees in the yard have begun to bear small sweet apples. In the last year the birds have nested in their gnarled boughs. Sorry. Okay, that was The Shunned House. That was a really hard story to read. I did not like it at all, unfortunately. There's just so many run-on sentences in that story, and just the weirdest rambling in words that just did not need to be there. That was just really, really tiring to read, which, unfortunately, I am not going to last as long as I thought I would. I probably need to cut the stream short, but I will actually stream tomorrow on an off day. Don't tell anybody this, but I will stream tomorrow on a Wednesday. Don't get too excited. This was actually supposed to be the last episode for this book, but I still have 3 stories to go, and it's a 200-something page book, which I thought I would breeze through within 3 episodes, but I was mistaken. So I'm very tired though, and I would like to read more, but it's just I'm so exhausted. Don't say that. It's just, I think this was a poorly written story. It's not about intelligence. It's just very, for as good as a writer H.P. Lovecraft was, I think this is a weaker story, and it also had a good ending, which I don't like. I like the stories that have bad endings because it's scarier that way. I don't know, I just felt like that story was not very good. And it's really strange because we've been having microphone problems, I feel like. It just feels like through my headset it's just been coming in and out. I don't know what's going on. So, hopefully we can mitigate those issues before tomorrow. And I will be doing this also midday tomorrow. It's not normal. So unfortunately you will be seeing this during the daylight. And so I don't expect many, if any, people to show up, but it'll be uploaded regardless, so people can watch it whenever. So I'm gonna go ahead and call it a night. I'm sorry I didn't get to continue more, but it do be this way sometimes, and yep. I will go ahead and leave it at that. Here is a final glimpse at Mr. Tungus. Take it in. Mr. Tungus. Alright. Have a good night, and I will see you